Hey guys, I wanted to come and talk to you without the gimmick, without the filter, without the comedic effect prior to getting into the content of this video. And that's specifically because this part in particular has had me go through a roller coaster more than I had expected it would, emotionally. And I can't begin to tell you how hollow inside I felt after finishing the last few lines of this script. So I want you guys to come into this understanding exactly what you've signed up for if you want to continue this particular part of this series. I want you to understand that things are going to get far more graphic, far more depraved, and far more depressing than you would expect or have ever imagined this case to get. Up to this point, yeah, it's been pretty graphic. I've talked about some pretty disgusting things, but this one's gonna be a whole other ballpark. I am gonna leave it at how it ends, even if it has the very specific tone it ends in. So if you guys have the stomach, and you have the emotional fortitude to actually finish this video all the way through, be aware of what you're getting into. In December 1988, the blissful anonymity started to crack and fall apart when Hendy's former boyfriend and a reason for moving to Truth or Consequences made a surprise reappearance, John Youngblood. After convincing her to take him back, the tumultuous couple went nose deep into the same habits of drinking and shooting up before getting into violent fights. This habit was financed by their epileptic divorced neighbor, Merritt Storm, who gave Hendy money to run errands during the day and would placate them with cash in the middle of the night when they wanted to keep partying. The couple had begun mooching off of Storm when they heard about his large divorce settlement through the grapevine. He recounted later how sick Hendy would become after Youngblood's return, how she complained of constant pain, while also bragging about being such an addict she had to shoot crank into her hands due to her veins being collapsed. On the night of December 17th, Youngblood and Hendy had an argument that exploded when Hendy decided it was a good idea to admit to her continued sexual relationship with Yancey. Youngblood went into a blind rage that not only had him go to Storm's home asking where Yancey lived, but had Yancey trying to hide out of pure fear, and Hendy giving a sworn affidavit to the police stating that threats were made and she had been assaulted. Yancey moved into the Lampus trailer during this time and made the serious mistake of admitting he was a terrorist and stating it was easy to kill someone and dispose of the body while in business talks with them. The toxic couple of Hendy and Youngblood were back together again 4 days later, with Hendy delivering a handwritten note to the court stating that she had lied in her sworn affidavit and requesting all charges against him be dropped. After this incident, the two drew even more attention to them, Hendy exposing herself to children at a Christmas party and having a confrontation at Storm's home on Christmas Eve. At 11:30 p.m. that night, Hendy called Storm from a battered wives' shelter asking for a change of clothes, telling him that she had been beaten up again and received treatment at Sierra Vista Hospital before going to the shelter she was calling from. Storm brought her back to his home where she started chasing her painkillers with alcohol and swearing up and down that she would make Youngblood pay for what he had done. She spent 3 hours regurgitating her entire life story and every time she was beaten or abused before Storm called Ray to come pick her up. The day after, Ray called over Padilla and made it clear that he wanted Youngblood dead for what had been done to Hendy. Padilla also recounted that when he went to the Ray home, he saw Hendy had been beaten so heavily that one of her eyes were closed and her face was extremely swollen. This threat from Ray got to Youngblood and spooked him enough to make him flee from truth or consequences for good. Hendy spent another night at Storm's home where she chased painkillers with wine to the point that she started hallucinating, leaving after a few hours of sleep for court. Youngblood was ultimately given probation contingent upon him staying out of Sierra County and never seeing Hendy again. Jessie moved out of her father's home and in with relatives in Galveston, while Cindy was asked to move in with Ray in early 1999, triumphing over Mayla Moquin, her rival since she started seeing Ray. Though this move was outwardly positive, with Ray weaning Hendy off alcohol and drugs, she was secretly being groomed as the perfect accomplice for his depraved fetishes. Hendy was overjoyed to see his toy box and learn Ray's extensive torture process through diagrams he kept on the walls of the trailer, use of tiny figures, and an 18-point list of instructions on how to handle a freshly procured captive. These procedures read as follows. Titled Psychological and Physical Procedures Initial Handling of the Captive Personal Fetish. Number 1. The new female captive should be gagged and blindfolded with wrists and ankles chained. Number 2. Move her into the recreation room. Place her body under the suspension chains. Number 3, stand her up under the chains and lock her wrists well above her head. Number 4, place the neck chain around her neck and lock it into place. It is permanent. Number 5, clip her leg irons to the floor chain. Number 6, use scissors to slowly remove her dress, blouse, or sweater. Cut and remove the bra. Number 7, fondle and abuse her breasts, nipples, and other parts of her body. Number 8, keep her blindfolded to increase disorientation. Use verbal abuse, dumb bitch, slut, etc. Number 9, slowly unzip, open, and remove the lower clothing. Cut or rip the panties off. Number 10, fondle and abuse her sex organs. Continue the verbal abuse. Number 11, attach the overhead suspension straps to her body, ankles, waist, hips, and upper chest. Number 12, remove the leg irons and tighten the ankle straps, pulling her legs upwards until the middle part of her body is horizontal. The ankle straps will force her legs wide apart. Number 13, tighten and adjust the waist, hip, and chest straps until the middle of her body is straight. Clip the short force chain to the bottom ring on the waist belt so she cannot jerk or lift her body upward. Number 14, at this point, the captive is suspended at a convenient height, immobilized and fully exposed. She is uncomfortable, disoriented, and probably terrified. Don't cut her any slack. Continue the verbal and physical abuse. Keep her mentally off balance. Number 15. Play with her sex organs. Rape her vagina and anus. Force large dildos deep into both holes. Use clamps, needles, and other devices on her tits and sex organs. Clip and cut lips. Whip her and use electroshock. Number 16. Don't give her time to collect her thoughts. Use her body aggressively during the first hour or two. She will sweat, struggle a lot, and exhaust herself, particularly if the electric shock machine is used extensively. Number 17. Intensify her fear. Tell her how she is going to be kept as a sex slave. Describe in detail how she will be continuously raped and tortured. Work on her mind as well as her body. And finally, number 18. Keep her body suspended 2 or 3 hours. Then lower the gynecological bench directly beneath her. Lower her body onto the bench. Release one arm or one leg at a time and secure it to the bench until she is strapped down. Buckle all the straps on her body until she is totally immobilized. Feet in the stirrups and knees forced wide apart. Note, the shock value of disorientation plus continuous verbal and physical abuse during the first few hours of confinement will have a great influence on how docile and subdued the captive will be during the remaining period of captivity. If it is done properly, she will be intimidated and much easier to handle. Hendy's first victim turned out to be a woman we were introduced to in the previous part of this series, Angelica Montano. Born into a life that can justifiably be called hell in 1972, her lack of familial support and education placed her directly into the world of drugs and prostitution. She ended up in Truth or Consequences after completing rehab in the hopes of turning her life around, only to be met with a boyfriend who was never around due to his job, having a son she could barely afford while on welfare, and a clandestine meeting and friendship with Cindy Hendy. She slipped back into her old ways as an alcoholic drug user, selling her body to fund her habit, which ended up getting her in the yacht situation with the Rays, Yancey, and Hendy. Though they allegedly were close confidants and remained as such even after the yacht incident because of their shared drug habits, the cracks in their relationship showed when Montano started seeing Stormy behind her boyfriend's back. She ran errands for Stormy as Hendy had previously, but because a romantic relationship blossomed with Montano, it caused a noticeable feud between them for his attention. The rivalry came to a head and Montano was chosen as Hendy's first victim when Stormy invited the two women to his home for dinner. They showed up unreasonably drunk with uninvited friends, causing trouble by saying exactly how much they hated each other face to face. Storm kicked everyone out in a fuss and Montano's death warrant was signed. On February 17th, 1999, Hendy lured Angelica to Truth or Consequences District Courthouse with the promise of giving her a cake mix, which would be used for her boyfriend's birthday. She showed up to the courthouse parking lot at 10 a.m. and waited until Ray and Hendy arrived in his pickup truck at 11:30 a.m. Hendy claimed that she had forgotten the cake mix and suggested they go back to Elephant Butte to get it, promising to bring her back home in time for her to bake the birthday cake. Montano agreed to go with them and endured the drive to 513 Bass Road in complete silence before she was convinced to sit in the trailer Ray had been pulling behind his truck to wait for them to get the cake mix. To her shock and horror, Ray returned with a rusty brown box in one hand and a dagger in the other before pressing the blade to her neck and telling her she was being abducted against her will. At first, she believed it to be a prank because she was blind in one eye and it made it impossible for her to see the knife at her neck, and the truth of her situation only set in when Ray punched her in the face and Hendy put a pistol to her head. Montano was stripped naked before she was bound to the bed in the trailer via a padlocked dog collar and handcuffs on her wrists and ankles. A leather mask was put over her head so nobody could hear her scream as the infamous induction tape was played for her. The initial ordeal ending when Hendy shoved an orange pill down her throat before Montano passed out. She woke to being blindfolded and wrapped up in a blanket only to be forced to take a second orange pill to make her sleep again. The next day, while Ray was off at work, Hendy was tasked with watching Montano and did so dutifully while watching soap operas and arguing with the other woman about setting her free. The arguing ceased when Hendy started waving a pistol around, and Montano remained silent the rest of the day, even while Ray sat half-naked watching television when he returned. One night, while Hendy was out getting groceries, Montano pleaded with Ray to reassure her that she was going to be alright and nothing bad would happen to her. Disgustingly, Ray acquiesced and gave her the reassurance with a hug. Hendy returned, watched a movie with Ray, and then proceeded to talk about killing Meulen and her little boy, along with making her 10-year-old daughter a sex slave. Not only did they come up with this depraved plan that would make most people vomit, they discussed the shooting and a murder of a man in the trailer and how messy it was. Almost 3 days later, Montano would be taken to the toy box for the first time after a dehumanizing bath because Ray, quote-unquote, liked to have his victims clean. Hendy painted her face with makeup before she was walked to the toy box by her metal leash, Ray putting a blank tape in the video recorder as soon as they got there. She was blindfolded and gagged before she was blindsided with a punch to the stomach, forcing her back to a table she was subsequently tied to before being sodomized by a long wooden device. Once he was done completely tying her down, he removed the device from her rectum and forced her onto the gynecological chair with arms and legs spread as far apart as possible. Montano pleaded with her captors, saying that she couldn't breathe, only to be met with cruel laughter from Hendy. She was once again subjected to the disgusting audio tape before alligator clips leading to a generator were placed on her nipples and womanhood, Hendy taking a sick pleasure in turning the electrical current as high as it could go. They took pleasure in the sounds she made as they turned the electrical current up and down over and over again, using an assortment of dildos while they experimented. Even with all of this going on, Ray was completely flaccid. The experimentation with the generator was soon shifted to a stun gun and cattle prod, which they used in countless heinous ways. They continued to torture her for an hour before Ray finally forced himself erect with a cock ring and ordered Montano to perform oral sex on him. In an almost brilliant attempt to earn his mercy, she performed to her best ability and pretended to enjoy what she was doing until he was brought to completion. Montana was told after begging Ray to let her go that she would be given a shot to make her forget the horrible ordeal and release her. Ray became oddly paternal and stated that he wouldn't have abducted her had he known her better, letting her call a friend so she could catch a bus to Albuquerque before chaining her up to the bed she'd been in previously. The next morning, after 4 long days of torture, Montana was released from her bindings and was given her clothing and a cup of coffee with only the request for a hug in return. Montano spoke about how she handled her captivity later, saying the following. He told me everything was going to be alright. He goes, "Don't worry, nothing's going to happen to you." I was playing the part with them, like I was a friend. It's a good thing I did play head games with him and get him to be on my side. If I would have fought them and started being a bitch, I think I would have died. She was finally released at a bus stop on the northbound exit of the 125 freeway, keeping them on her good side by saying she wanted to do everything over again with them being the victim. Fate smiled upon Montano after that, and she was picked up by a plainclothes narcotics officer, Officer Gary Leyba, who pulled over out of genuine concern for her. After 10 minutes of silence, and without her knowing Leyba was a cop, she divulged everything that had happened with Ray and Hendy to him. When he asked why she was abducted, she could not give him a definitive answer. Though Leyba didn't believe her and suggested that she file a report, she never did and left the fate of her abductors up to God. Even after being dutiful and loyal to Ray, Hendy became the weak link in the chain that ultimately was the group's undoing. She started shooting up and drinking herself stupid just weeks after Montano's release, boasting about everything she knew for the first time on March 13th, 1999. While drinking directly from a bottle of white wine, Hendy boasted to Jean and John Brana about how Ray had murdered and put 6 or 7 women in the lake by his property. She told them about the shooting of a man in his trailer, about how she wanted to experience the rush of murder, and how she couldn't wait to suffocate the next woman she and Ray would abduct. Hendy also confirmed that Ray followed the same trend of most serial killers, and that he would go after those who would never be missed, such as girls taken from across the Mexican border, druggies, and prostitutes. She boasted that Ray had been doing this for over 20 years and had taken hundreds of victims during that time, claiming that they would abduct another victim to amuse Ray while she was visiting family as she left the Brana home. Hendy and Ray became engaged 2 days later, and Montano returned to Truth or Consequences to beg Storm for help after a doctor refused to prescribe her Valium. Storm obliged her, and once she was calmed down, she divulged the ordeal she had experienced just weeks earlier. Montano ruined the relationship with Storm after stealing his wallet and refusing to return it, only to show up out of the blue again later looking for more money, which he refused. On March 20th, Ray convinced Hendy to put off her plans to visit family with the promise of an escalated abduction with the next slave, and headed with her to Albuquerque in his Toyota RV. They took with them the following items they'd become accustomed to: stun gun, knife, handcuffs and other restraints, leather mask, metal collar, and chains. They parked in a parking lot frequented by prostitutes off Washington and Central Avenue, Ray talking to a pimp and discussing getting a blowjob from one of his girls. Ray sat in his RV waiting to be serviced by the victim that was ultimately their undoing, 22-year-old drug-addicted prostitute Cynthia Vigil. Before the transaction could even be completed, she was ambushed with a silver badge in her face, the threat that she was under arrest for solicitation, and Hendy appearing with a stun gun to confirm the interaction was videotaped. She was tackled to the ground and practically jumped when she tried to run, the two handcuffing her and securing her for the drive back to Elephant Butte with duct tape over her mouth. A clearly intoxicated Hendy lied to Vigil by saying she was only going to be raped before she was released, a knife kept to her throat with one hand while the other held a wine bottle she guzzled during the drive. After a stop at a gas station for cigarettes and wine, the two forced their captives to strip naked before putting a mask with only a hole for her mouth over her head and tying her ankles with rope. As an aside, what occurred next was horrid enough for me to dry heave, so, as I said previously, I advise you to either skip ahead to this timestamp or stop watching this video completely if you cannot handle the most graphic description of events I have told to date on this channel. Once at the Ray household, Vigil was restrained by her limbs with straps in different directions and the dog collar placed around her neck before she was played the orientation tape like with every other victim. She was sodomized with two different objects, one in her rear and the other in her womanhood, and the electrical generator used on Montana was attached to her in the same places. The entirety of this was watched by Hendy, who held Vigil at gunpoint to keep her from running away or resisting. She endured 30 minutes of shock torture before her legs were kept further apart by a metal bar placed between her legs. She was chained to the wall, and her womanhood was filled with and covered in gravy. A dog was brought in to lick away the gravy from her as she was closely watched, defiling the woman more than any human being should ever endure. She was given a short reprieve after the session was over to sleep until the next morning and relieve herself at gunpoint before she was once again forced to endure the most despicable forms of torture. She was blindfolded and gagged with duct tape before she was hogtied to an elaborate system of leather straps that would be connected to an overhead hook with a rope that ran through them. She was suspended 3 feet in the air before the duct tape was ripped from her eyes, so she was forced to watch an intense flogging session and what could only be described as a pair of anguish, outfitted with spikes at the end, being inserted into her womanhood. Another toy was inserted into her rectum while Hendy egged Ray on and took pictures of her anguish. She didn't even get a full reprieve when they were done with the second torture session before she was awoken again later that day and dragged back into the trailer for more torture. She was rigged up to a pulley system with clamps on her breasts that connected to weights at the bottom, the weights stretching her chest as Ray set to shocking her thighs and legs. After all the pain she endured in a 2-day span, her body finally gave out and she lost consciousness. The next morning, after telling her she would be tortured in the toy box as opposed to the trailer she'd been in the last 3 sessions, Ray left Vigil chained to the wall by her dog collar inside his residence's den under Hendy's supervision. This ultimately would prove to be their undoing as the weak link failed to keep the rest of the chain intact. Hendy's first mistake was dropping the keys to Vigil's collar on a coffee table just feet from where she was being restrained. The depraved woman set to watching television, only talking to her captive when she was asked why her abduction and subsequent torture happened. Hendy's second mistake was becoming overly cocky and telling Vigil every depraved detail Ray wanted kept hidden away. She told Vigil of how she would be drugged like the other women into forgetting the ordeal after a couple months of captivity, alluded to Ray having extensive experience with the procedure they used on her, bragged about the abduction of Montano just weeks earlier, and stated the next victim would be a 10-year-old girl who would be groomed as a sex slave. The third and final mistake Hendy made was leaving the den to watch TV in another room without retrieving the keys to their captive's freedom off of the nearby coffee table. As soon as Hendy was gone, Vigil got as far as the leash would let her and used her feet and legs to drag the coffee table close enough for her to grab the keys from it. She freed herself from the wall, the collar still on her neck, and quietly moved to the phone in the room, dialing 911 and waiting for her only chance at survival to pick up on the other end of the line. Before she could even speak to an operator, Hendy realized her mistake and attempted to subdue the other woman by striking her in the head with a glass lamp. While Hendy scrambled to hang up the phone, and with blood streaming down from the gash on her head, Vigil grabbed an ice pick from a nearby table and battered her captor over the head until she was able to free herself and bolt out the front door. Though Hendy had tried to keep Vigil from getting help, the intercepted 911 call was ultimately her saving grace, as she was seen by law enforcement running down the road after it was reported on police scanner. While Vigil was transported to Sierra Vista Hospital in Truth or Consequences by emergency services, Hendy came to and realized how badly she had fucked up. After calling Ray at work and being instructed to remain calm at home, Hendy answered a follow-up call asking about the intercepted 911 call she had interrupted just minutes earlier and set off every red flag as she attempted to reassure the dispatcher everything was alright before hanging up again. Ray returned and got Hendy in his RV so they could search for Vigil, but they were arrested just blocks away when they found themselves faced with a police roadblock. The two surrendered to law enforcement and were taken to the Elephant Butte State Park Ranger Station, Ray acting as though nothing was amiss. While Ray and Hendy were being arrested, Deputy Lucas Alvarez, the officer that responded to the calls of Vigil running naked through the street, handed an inconsolable Vigil over to Sierra Vista Hospital staff for immediate care. Her broken and bloody body was covered in nothing but a pink robe with a metal collar and 6 inches chain leash attached to it, bolt cutters being used to remove the heavy burden from her neck. Before being interviewed later the same night, the following injuries were noted as she was treated: puncture wounds on her breasts, lacerations on her back, abrasions on her wrists, and a multitude of cuts and bruises everywhere on her body. 34-year-old rookie criminal investigator, New Mexico State Police Special Agent Wesley LaCuesta was the first to investigate this horrid crime and carefully took notes on everything her captors did to her over the last 4 days. While Vigil was being interviewed, 513 Bass Road was being raided by another team of officers led by Deputy Sheriff Pete Boadoix, before the reins were turned over to Sergeant Keith Rogers due to the scope of what was there being too large a task for the initial team on the scene to handle. A multitude of warrants were prepared through the remainder of the night before Ray and Hendy were booked at Sierra County Detention Center on charges of kidnapping, assault, conspiracy, and criminal assault, penetration. The investigation was so large in scope that FBI Special Agent Trent Pedersen was assigned to assist New Mexico Police Special Agent John Briscoe with the massive task of gathering forensic evidence from the entire property of 513 Bass Road. Believing the toy box to be a typical horse trailer, a locksmith was called to open the horrid torture chamber and bring to light just how depraved its owner truly was. Even with all the experience everyone involved in the investigation had, they were in no way prepared for what they saw within. I've covered a majority of what lay within the toy box throughout this series, so I won't go over all of that again. I will, however, point out 2 very specific things that Special Agent Briscoe found that were especially chilling. On the board above the coffin kept in the trailer was a note posted that read, "Don't let her get to you. If she was worth taking, she's worth keeping. Never trust a chained captive." The second item found was a detailed map of Elephant Butte Lake with approximately a dozen markings in different locations that is speculated to be the final resting place of prior victims that never got away. Hendy and Ray were taken to Sierra County Detention Center the next day, where they spent the next 16 hours being thoroughly interviewed by Agent LaCuesta, both telling the same unbelievable story that they were torturing Vigil as a part of a drug rehabilitation program. When pressed further on their story, Hendy tried to manipulate the situation to the point of almost blaming the victim and admitting Vigil was targeted because she was a prostitute. She fucked up again by contradicting herself, saying she was not involved in the mess to begin with. Ray was the complete antithesis of his partner, willingly admitting he tortured Vigil and even drawing a picture of a butt plug, as he described how it was used on her. He eventually stopped complying and stated that he wanted to get a lawyer, admitting he understood the gravity of his situation. During all of this, the dots started to be connected by Storm and the Braunas, as they both saw the story break on every major news channel, contacting each other and discussing the similarities between what they had been told by Hendy and Montano. Montano became part of the investigation once both Storm and the Braunas reported what they knew to law enforcement. Hendy and Ray were arraigned at Sierra County Magistrates Court as a couple, both claiming they were innocent to reporters on the way to the beginning stage of their trial. Ray was charged with kidnapping, 3 counts of criminal sexual penetration, assault with the intent to commit a violent felony, along with 2 charges of conspiracy to commit kidnapping and criminal sexual penetration. Hendy was charged with kidnapping, accessory to the crime of criminal sexual penetration, assault with the intent to commit a violent felony, criminal sexual penetration, and conspiracy to kidnap. With all charges being pressed, the 2 faced $85,000 in fines and up to 93 years incarcerated, a $1 million bond placed on both of them. The heavy charges levied against her finally set in for Hendy, and she decided to approach LaCuesta of her own accord, waiving her rights and willingly stating she had information that would help convict Ray. The tale told had LaCuesta absolutely dumbfounded, listening as he was told at least 14 women were victimized by Ray and that pictures of all of them were taken and left in the trailer. Hendy claimed the bodies were dumped in 3 different states and that there were 2 in New Mexico alone. one north of Truth or Consequences in a ravine area and the other one between Caballo Lake and Truth or Consequences. The entire confession was taped, and Hendy was returned to her jail cell with all notes taken in the interview being transferred to a search warrant that was briefed to Sergeant Rogers and ultimately to the FBI Behavioral Science Unit based in Quantico, Virginia. 3 leading officers were dispatched to Elephant Butte to create a profile for Ray, offering the following preliminary guidelines to the newly branded serial sexual sadist. Based upon information relating to the photos, journals, and statements to officers by Hendy, the Behavioral Sciences Unit has advised that persons who act as Ray has been described as acting will often keep mementos or trophies from their victims. Persons such as Ray will then bury these items near trees or plants, and in watering the trees or plants will be caring for the memento or trophy buried near it. It was noted that replanting trees or bushes that already were planted on the property was a sign of where Ray may have hidden trophies from his victims, which became more of a reality when neighbors attested to him doing exactly that multiple times. Hendy repeated her confession to LaQuesta, Sergeant Rogers, and FBI agent Larry Howe with even more detail in the second interview. She repeated the story Ray told her of his first victim back when he was a teenager, the one he tied to a tree and murdered, along with implicating Yancey in the murder of Parker years earlier. Brana summed up Hendy's situation in a very telling way during an interview with KOB TV. Quote unquote, Cindy said she had read serial killer magazines and books her whole life, and now she was living with one. 4 days after Vigil's escape and the arrest of Hendy and Ray, multiple FBI evidence response teams descended on 513 Elephant Butte to properly process carefully divided portions of the property. The crime scene was expanded into Bass Road to keep reporters at bay while they meticulously set to getting every piece of evidence possible in order to figure out just what exactly happened there. They didn't find any evidence of murder, but found plenty to confirm that Vigil was not the first person to be preyed upon by Ray and his cohorts, the big break coming the next day. Montano returned to Truth or Consequences at the behest of Storm and the Branas, watching the footage that they had taped of the story first hitting television screens. She broke down, demanded that Storm give her the tape, and definitively decided she was going to go to the police to add her story to Vigil's. They couldn't flag a police officer down, so Gene Brana drove Montano directly to the Bass Road checkpoint, where FBI agents heard everything that happened just weeks before Vigil was abducted. The case started to get national attention just a week later as Montano gave an anonymous interview to Good Morning America for an undisclosed sum of money. The attention caused press to show up in such high numbers that Elephant Butte and Truth or Consequences broke record business revenue for hotels and restaurants. Within hours after Montano's interview, FBI agents found a videotape under a tripod by the back door of the toy box, booking it into evidence and discovering that it was of a third victim, Kelly Von Cleve. Cleve was identified through the tribal Native American swan tattoo on her right calf 2 weeks later. The new evidence gained from Montano's cooperation resulted in another 11 felony counts of kidnapping and criminal penetration for the depraved couple. A huge press conference was held with a multitude of prominent players in the investigation speaking to the communities of Elephant Butte and Truth or Consequences to assure them of their safety. They failed massively when news outlets cherry-picked the conference to put out pieces highlighting the admission of a speaker to the case being extremely disturbing and dark. Just after Easter weekend, the toy box was taken to the FBI's Santa Fe branch office for forensic analysis by Special Agent Patty Rust. Agent Rust was an Army veteran and highly experienced FBI agent that held an advanced degree in criminology, having seen more than most agents ever would. 5 days in the toy box was more than she could have ever imagined or endured. Agent Rust walked out of the trailer, took out her service firearm, and with one bullet to the head, died immediately right in front of the very assignment she just completed. An unnamed state official said the following about the suicide. Quote unquote, she couldn't handle what she had seen. God knows what it did to her, spending 5 days with that stuff. The FBI's official line is that her suicide wasn't connected, but what do you think? I wanted to take the time out to thank my lovely patrons for their support of the channel, Jessica, Debbie, and Mike. Thank you so much for your support, and if you want to become a patron as well and see these videos 24 hours prior to their public release, the link for my Patreon is down below.